सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
There's been a lot about Rajiv Gandhi in the news recently. It was his birth anniversary and Congress ruled states took those terrible full-page ads on the front pages of newspapers. And then a couple of days ago, I anchored an event to mark the launch of Manishankar Iyer's memoir. And though the memoir is about Manishankar Iyer's life, a lot of it, at least the last part, is all about Rajiv Gandhi. So there we were talking about Rajiv Gandhi with Sonia Gandhi in the audience. And as I read the memoir, as I listened to what people had to say, I began to wonder, do we really value Rajiv Gandhi enough for what he did for India? The general impression among people who are well disposed towards him is that he was a nice chap, he did his best, but he was a bit naive, which is not entirely wrong, but I think it seriously undervalues what Rajiv achieved. I think to understand Rajiv, you have to understand how people are now responding to him. The BJP's point of view is that Indira Gandhi was fine. She was a supreme leader. But supreme leaders are not such a bad thing, are they? Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. And even when there's the awkwardness of the emergency to explain, they say, the Congress party imposed the emergency. I've hardly ever heard anybody of consequence in the BJP blaming Indira Gandhi for what she did. Congress people, of course, by definition, are obliged to say that Indira Gandhi was the greatest leader ever. And if you were to take a honest accounting of what Mrs. Gandhi achieved, there were many significant achievements. She steered India through a difficult phase. She redefined Indian politics. She kept us going through poverty, through food shortages, through droughts. And most of all, I suppose, she destroyed our main enemy. She broke Pakistan into two parts and she liberated the people of Bangladesh. So yes, no dispute that Indira Gandhi had substantial achievements. But for the rest of Indira Gandhi's reign, I always say to liberals who say she was so wonderful, please remember that when she was alive, liberals did not think she was so wonderful. The best way to understand what she did, I think, is to forget that she was a Congress Prime Minister, because we now divide the world into Congress versus BJP, liberal versus right wing. Assume she was a BJP Prime Minister. You then had a Prime Minister who did her best to take the institutions of governance and to bend them to her will. The civil service was asked to be committed. Neutral civil servants were passed over. There was a distinct and definite attempt to interfere in the functioning of the Supreme Court. Supersession of judges was normal. Good judges were pushed aside. Chamchas were promoted. We seem to think that's okay. Her ministers counted for very little. The most important person in India, except for Indira Gandhi, was her stenographer, R.K. Dhawan. He appointed ministers, ministers paid court to him, he called all the shots, he controlled access to Mrs. Gandhi, and he did not hesitate to use his power. The institutions of Indian democracy that we now rave about, all of them were bent by Mrs. Gandhi to her will, from cabinet government to the civil service to the courts. And then, of course, there's the emergency. Can we ever forget that she suspended civil liberties, that she censored the press, that she locked up the entire opposition, and that she legitimized dynasty by promoting her motor mechanic son, who had no political experience and not a lot of common sense? Now, if a BJP Prime Minister had done all this, how would liberals react? But no, because Indira Gandhi was a Congress Prime Minister, they say, she had her faults, but she wasn't so bad. Well, actually, she had her good points, but basically she was pretty bad. Let's be honest about this. But of course, we don't say that. Unfortunately, unless you say that, you can't understand what Rajiv Gandhi inherited. That was the India he inherited. And that was the India he set right. The civil service was left pretty much on its own. He didn't interfere. The Supreme Court was left to do as it wanted. He didn't play around with judges. Dhawan came back briefly at the very end, but only for political manipulation. There was no culture where you had stenographers running the country. Mrs. Gandhi had people like Dhirendra Brahmachari, the very sleazy Swami who was part of her court. There was no such person in the Rajiv Gandhi establishment. There was no court as such. You went through an institutional structure. This is such a huge and important achievement because it put Indian democracy and the institutions of liberal democracy back on track. And yet, we hardly ever talk about it. We forget also that Mrs. Gandhi's style was confrontation. We know about the mess she made in Punjab. We know how Bhindranwale was created by the Congress to fight the Akalis, how he went out of control, how she waited too long to take action against him. And when she did take action with Operation Blue Star, which damaged the Sikh psyche enormously. We know what happened in Mizoram. In 1966, she sent the Indian Air Force to bomb Mizoram. We know what happened in Assam. There was an agitation that went on and on under Indira Gandhi. It is to Rajiv Gandhi's credit that these agitations, these insurgencies, these disputes were largely resolved. In Mizoram, he got Lal Denga, who was a rebel leader who'd lived outside of India for 20 years, to come back to India. He made him chief minister. He brought him within the system. The existing chief minister, who Lal Denga had actually tried to assassinate, was made his deputy. The old chief minister accepted this. Lal Denga functioned as a proper chief minister, and the problems in Mizoram ended. With the Sikhs, he sought out Sant Longowal, and he did an accord. He did similarly an accord in Assam. There were consequences. The Congress lost power in Assam. The AGP, which he had now legitimized, won power. But I don't think he cared because he looked at the bigger picture. He looked at what he wanted India to be. Unless you look at these achievements and you realize what kind of India he inherited and what he tried to do with it, I don't think you can understand what Rajiv Gandhi was about or what he did. Now, people will say about Mrs. Gandhi that, despite whatever you may say, she was secular. Yeah, I'm not even sure what secular means. Mrs. Gandhi, particularly in her second term, was more Hindu than most BJP leaders today. She went from godman to godman. She didn't make a move without consulting tantrics or astrologers. And yes, I agree, she was not anti-Muslim. But the Hindu wave that she engendered was based basically on hatred, if not hatred, let's just say disdain of the Sikh community. And it was this hatred that ultimately led to those terrible riots, massacres really, not riots, in 1984. Rajiv did his best, I think, after 1984 by doing the accord to try and heal the wounds. And ultimately, Punjab did come back into the national mainstream. But again, Rajiv never gets any credit for that. He's blamed for the Sikh riots, which I think he had very little role in. He'd just taken over. And it's possible, I think, that some people around him say Arun Nehru knew what was going on. And there's no doubt that senior Congress leaders in Delhi were involved. But to lay it all at his door, I think is a mistake and a misjudgment. And yet we never give Rajiv credit for any of this. The middle class looks past Rajiv. And we look at Narasimha Rao and we say, he liberalized the economy. Rajiv didn't do that. We'll get to that in a minute as to why he liberalized the economy. But do we realize that during that period, he returned to many of Mrs. Gandhi's old practices? One of the most important men in the country was N.K. Sharma, his astrologer. Ministers would go to him and ask for posts. Chandra Swami, the sleaziest guy to hang out with the Prime Minister of India, made his home, more or less, at the Prime Minister's house. He would conduct havans at number 5 Racecourse Road. Industrialists would get deals done through Chandra Swami. That was Narasimha Rao. When he thought he was going to lose his election, he bought MPs. There's a court case about it. MPs were convicted in this. Narasimha Rao himself was convicted by the courts of criminal offenses. And yet all this is airbrushed out of the picture and he's hailed as some great champion. Which leaves us with the big question. What would have happened if Rajiv Gandhi had not been assassinated? If you look back at the 1991 election, it's clear the Congress would not have won an overall majority. In fact, even after the assassination, it did not. But I think Rajiv expected that. He expected to lead a minority government, which is exactly what Narasimha Rao did. Would he then have implemented the reforms? Well, frankly, he would have had no choice. No Prime Minister of India had any choice because the IMF held a gun to our heads and said, either you go bankrupt or you reform. But during the reforms, I think because he was a free marketeer at heart, he would have done much better than, say, Narasimha Rao did, who lost interest after the first year or so, and the reform process fizzled away. So I don't think reforms is the issue. That leaves us with only one key issue. What would the social fabric of India have been like? At this event I moderated with Mani Shankar Iyer, he told a story of being summoned by Narasimha Rao when he was saying things Narasimha Rao regarded as too secular. And he told him, Iyer, never forget that this is a Hindu country. Now, Mani went to one extreme and said, Narasimha Rao was the first BJP Prime Minister of India. I won't go that far. But it's quite clear that he did not have the same commitment to the minorities as even Rajiv, or even when it comes to Muslims, that Indira Gandhi did. He was very much cast in that Hindu mold with his havans and his sadhus and his stooges and his cronies. It's clear that if Rajiv had been Prime Minister, he would have not accepted Kalyan Singh's assurances that he would protect the Babri Masjid, because he would have known the BJP, in fact, had encouraged the movement towards the demolition of the masjid. If Rajiv had been Prime Minister, the masjid would still be standing today. Under Narasimha Rao, it was reduced to rubble. Now, you could argue, I think some people do argue, that Rajiv Gandhi caused a Hindu backlash because of the Shah Banu decision. Now, on Shah Banu, I think Rajiv was wrong. His initial instinct was right, but I think he changed his mind because of pressure, and he was wrong to do that. But the argument that if you're secular, you only encourage the BJP is a specious one, because Narasimha Rao was not secular. Narasimha Rao did everything possible to appease Hindus. And yet, did the BJP go away? No. It grew in influence. It grew in strength. So to argue that soft Hindutva is the only way to fight the BJP is ultimately to play the BJP's game. Plus, I think there's one key difference, which is that after the Babri Masjid was demolished, and Narasimha Rao made it clear which side he was on, Muslims turned away from the Congress. Muslims, I mean, every political party has a coalition that supports it. Muslims were an important part of the Congress coalition. After Narasimha Rao, they drifted away. They went to Mulayam. They went to other leaders. So by losing the Muslim vote for the Congress, Narasimha Rao actually cleared the way for the BJP, because he made it difficult for the Congress to ever win an election in the Hindi belt again. So think back to what Rajiv did. Don't venerate Indira Gandhi. She was not a great Prime Minister from the point of view of the institutions of democracy. And don't venerate Narasimha Rao. Yes, of course, there was liberalization. I think we owe him credit for that. But we all know the circumstances under which it happened. Think instead of the damage he did to the social fabric of this country. And think, if Rajiv had not been assassinated, would India be so polarized today? Would it be a country full of hate? Or would it be a different place? It's worth thinking about.